The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, as Harriet Grayson clutched her torn shawl tightly around her shoulders, fighting back tears that threatened to spill from her hazel eyes. The year was 1878, and the small frontier town in Colorado Territory had become both her sanctuary and her prison. 3 months ago, she'd fled the ruins of her former life with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terrible secret burning in her heart. Now, standing outside the general store with her meager earnings from a day of washing laundry, she wondered if she'd ever truly escape her past. "Miss Grayson, you all right there?" The deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Harriet quickly wiped at her eyes and turned to find Fletcher Tanner watching her with concern etched across his weathered face. At 32, Fletcher was one of the most respected ranchers in the territory and one of the few men in town who'd shown her genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. "I'm fine, Mr. Tanner. Just tired is all," she replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Fletcher studied her for a moment. His broad shoulders and tall frame cast a protective shadow in the fading light. The dark Stetson he wore couldn't hide the intensity in his blue eyes or the gentle way he regarded her. "Let me walk you home. Streets ain't always safe this time of evening." Harriet hesitated. At 24, she'd learned the hard way about trusting men, yet something about Fletcher Tanner made her want to believe in goodness again. "That would be kind of you, thank you." They walked in companionable silence through the main street. Fletcher slowed his naturally long stride to match her shorter steps, and Harriet found herself relaxing slightly in his presence. "How's work at Mrs. Johnson's boarding house?" he asked, tipping his hat to an elderly couple they passed. "It pays for my room and board with a little left over." She didn't mention the blisters on her hands from scrubbing linens or the ache in her back from hauling water. "Mrs. Johnson is fair," Fletcher nodded. "She's a decent woman. Lost her husband in the war, knows something about hard times." As they turned down the narrow lane toward the boarding house, they passed the saloon. The piano music and raucous laughter spilled out onto the street along with the smell of whiskey and tobacco. A group of cowboys stood outside, and their conversation halted as Harriet approached. "Well, if it ain't the mystery woman," one called out, his words slightly slurred. "Were you hiding that husband of yours, darling?" Fletcher stepped slightly in front of her. "That's enough, Davis. Miss Grayson deserves your respect." The man named Davis put his hands up in mock surrender. "Just making conversation, Tanner. Town's curious about a pretty woman who keeps to herself. No ring, no family, makes folks wonder." "Then they can wonder silently," Fletcher replied, his voice carrying a warning that made Davis step back. The encounter left Harriet trembling as they continued walking. When they reached the boarding house, she paused on the bottom step. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Tanner." "Fletcher," he corrected gently. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Grayson." She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Harriet, please." Something in his expression softened. "Harriet, then." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "I'm heading into town on Saturday for supplies. Would be happy for the company if you need anything from Morris's store." The invitation was simple, innocent even, but Harriet felt her chest tighten with anxiety. "I don't think, just an offer," he said, seeming to sense her discomfort. "No obligation." Harriet studied him in the gathering darkness. His face was open, honest, so different from the last man who'd offered her kindness. "I'll think about it," she finally answered. Fletcher nodded, touched the brim of his hat respectfully, and turned to go. "Mr. Tanner Fletcher," she called after him. When he turned back, she struggled to find the right words. "People talk about me. It might be better if you weren't seen with me too often." His expression remained unchanged. "I've never much cared what people say, Harriet. Good night." She watched him walk away, a strange mixture of hope and dread building in her chest. In the safety of her small rented room, Harriet removed the locket she wore beneath her dress, the only valuable thing she still possessed. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents, both long dead. How disappointed they would be to see her now. "No respectable man will have me now," she whispered to the empty room, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Harriet rose early as usual, her duties at the boarding house beginning before sunrise. She built fires in the common room and dining area, then started preparing breakfast alongside Mrs. Johnson. "You look tired, girl," the older woman remarked as Harriet kneaded dough for biscuits. "Not sleeping well." "I'm fine, Mrs. Johnson, just dreams." The widow gave her a knowing look. Dreams have a way of following us from the past, don't they? Before Harriet could respond, there was a knock at the kitchen door. Mrs. Johnson answered it to find Fletcher Tanner standing there with a small crate of eggs. "Morning, Mrs. Johnson. Thought you might be able to use these." "My hens are laying more than I can eat." Mrs. Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly as she accepted the eggs. "Well, that's mighty generous, Mr. Tanner. We can certainly put them to good use." His eyes found Harriet's over Mrs. Johnson's shoulder. "Morning, Miss Grayson." Harriet felt heat rise in her cheeks as she nodded in acknowledgement. After he departed, Mrs. Johnson turned to Harriet with a speculative gleam in her eye. "Fletcher Tanner is a good man. Never known him to deliver eggs before." "It was just a kindness," Harriet murmured, focusing intently on her dough. "Hum," was all Mrs. Johnson said, but her expression spoke volumes. Throughout the day, Harriet found her thoughts returning to Fletcher despite her best efforts. As she hung sheets on the line, she recalled his gentle offer to accompany her to the general store. By afternoon, she had almost convinced herself to accept, but then she overheard a conversation between two women drawing water at the town pump. "Can you believe Fletcher Tanner walking that Grayson woman home, a man of his standing?" one said. "She's hiding something, mark my words," replied the other. "No family, no history, just appears out of nowhere. And have you noticed she jumps at her own shadow?" "Well, whatever her story is, Fletcher Tanner can do better. That Sarah Miller has had her eye on him for years now. There's a proper match." Harriet slipped away, her momentary courage evaporating. That evening, when Fletcher appeared at the boarding house just before supper, she sent word through Mrs. Johnson that she was indisposed. The next day, Fletcher was waiting outside the laundry where Harriet worked in the afternoons. Her heart skipped when she saw him leaning against the hitching post, his horse ground tied nearby. "Afternoon, Miss Grayson," he said, straightening as she emerged. "Mr. Tanner." She nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral despite the curious stares of the other laundry women. "Is there something you needed? Just wanted to check if you'd reconsidered my offer for tomorrow. Store gets mighty busy on Saturdays. Thought you might appreciate avoiding the crowd." Harriet glanced around, acutely aware of the attention they were attracting. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness, but I can't accept." Something like disappointment flickered in his eyes. "May I ask why?" "It wouldn't be proper," she said quietly. Fletcher took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Harriet, I respect you. I'm not offering anything improper. Just a ride into town and back." "It's not that simple," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It could be." She shook her head. "You don't understand. You're a respected rancher. I'm—" She trailed off, unable to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "You're a hard-working woman who deserves kindness," Fletcher finished for her. "That's all I see." Harriet felt tears threatening again. "Please, Mr. Tanner, there are plenty of suitable women in Redemption Creek. I'm not one of them." Before he could respond, she hurried past him, refusing to look back even when she heard him call her name. That night, she dreamed of her husband. Marcus Grayson had seemed like salvation when he'd proposed marriage to an orphaned, 19-year-old working as a housemaid in Philadelphia. Handsome and charming, he'd promised her a life of comfort and respect. Instead, he'd given her 5 years of escalating cruelty, ending with the night he'd beaten her so severely she'd lost the child she was carrying. When he finally passed out drunk, she'd gathered what little money she could find and fled west, changing her name but keeping his to maintain the appearance of respectability. Harriet woke gasping, her nightgown damp with sweat. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep would not return. She lit a candle and sat by her small window, watching the stars and wondering if she'd ever stop running from the shadows of her past. Saturday came, and Harriet found herself walking alone to the general store, her few coins carefully wrapped in a handkerchief. The store was indeed crowded, just as Fletcher had warned. She waited patiently for her turn, keeping her eyes lowered. "Miss Grayson." The store owner, Mr. Morris, greeted her with a nod. "What can I help you with today?" Just thread and a few buttons, please, she replied, placing her money on the counter. As Mr. Morris gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled. Harriet didn't need to turn to know Fletcher had entered the sudden hush in conversations, and the way Mr. Morris's eyes darted over her shoulder told her enough. "Afternoon, everyone," Fletcher's deep voice carried through the store. "Don't let me interrupt your business." The conversations gradually resumed as Fletcher made his way to the counter. He nodded politely to Harriet. "Miss Grayson." "Mr. Tanner," she acknowledged, accepting her purchases from Mr. Morris and preparing to leave. "Actually, Mr. Morris," Fletcher said, "I'll be paying for Miss Grayson's items along with mine." Harriet's head snapped up. "That's not necessary. Consider it a welcome gift. You've been in town, 3 months now? That's very kind, but I can't accept." She pushed her coins firmly toward Mr. Morris. Fletcher studied her for a moment, then nodded. "As you wish." Outside the store, Harriet quickened her pace, but Fletcher caught up to her easily. "Did I offend you back there?" She stopped, sighing. "No, you were being kind." "But I don't need charity." "It wasn't charity, Harriet. It was just a gesture." "Well, it's the kind of gesture that gets people talking." Fletcher looked around at the busy street. "People are always going to talk. Small town like this, gossip is better than reading material." Despite herself, Harriet felt a smile tugging at her lips. "That may be true, but I'd rather not be the main chapter." "Fair enough." He fell into step beside her. "At least let me walk you back. I'm headed that way anyhow." She knew she should refuse, but found herself nodding instead. They walked in silence for a few minutes before Fletcher spoke again. "I've got 20 acres of hay that needs cutting next week, thinking of having a work gathering. Most of the ranchers around here help each other out with big jobs." Harriet listened, not sure why he was telling her this. "Mrs. Johnson usually sends over some food for the workers. Thought maybe you'd like to come along, help with serving. Be a good way to meet some of the decent folks around here." She slowed her steps. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Tanner?" "Doing what?" "This," she gestured between them. "Being so persistent." Fletcher stopped walking altogether, turning to face her. His expression was serious now. "Because I see how hard you're trying to disappear, and I think that's a shame." Harriet felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to her secrets. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're running from something or someone. I know you work harder than any two people combined. I know you flinch when men raise their voices." His voice softened. "And I know what it's like to want to start over." She stared at him, wondering what demons he'd faced in his own past. 10 years ago, I came here with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back," Fletcher continued. "Lost everything in the war, including my brother. Took a long time before I felt like I belonged anywhere again." Harriet swallowed hard. "I'm sorry about your brother. Point is, everyone deserves a second chance, a place to put down roots. Redemption Creek was that for me." He gestured around them. "Could be that for you too if you'd let it." The sincerity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. Harriet looked away. "Some mistakes can't be fixed with a fresh start." "Maybe not, but they shouldn't define your whole future either." They had reached the boarding house. Harriet paused at the bottom of the steps, considering his words. "I'll think about the hay cutting," she finally said. Fletcher's smile was warm enough to chase away the spring chill in the air. "That's all I'm asking." When the day of the hay cutting arrived, Harriet found herself riding in Mrs. Johnson's wagon to Fletcher's ranch. The widow had been delighted when Harriet agreed to help with the food, and now she hummed cheerfully as she steered her 2 old mares down the well-traveled road. "Fletcher's made something fine out of that land," Mrs. Johnson remarked as they crested a hill. "When he first bought it, folks said it was too rocky for anything but grazing a few scrawny cattle. Now look at it." Harriet had to admit the view was impressive. Lush green hayfields stretched toward a creek lined with cottonwoods. Beyond the creek stood a sturdy 2-story farmhouse and a large red barn, with corrals and outbuildings dotting the property. Cattle grazed on distant hillsides, and horses moved in a paddock near the house. "Hard to believe one man did all this," Harriet said. Mrs. Johnson chuckled. "Well, he's not entirely alone. Has a foreman, Gil Roberts, who's been with him 5 years now, and a couple of steady ranch hands. But yes, Fletcher built most of it himself, piece by piece." As they approached the house, Harriet saw several wagons already parked in the yard. Men were gathering in the largest hayfield, tools in hand, while women set up tables under the shade of tall oak trees. Fletcher spotted them immediately and strode over to help Mrs. Johnson down from the wagon. "Ladies, welcome to Tanner Ranch." His eyes lingered on Harriet. "Glad you could make it." Throughout the morning, Harriet worked alongside the other women, setting out food and keeping water containers filled for the working men. She was surprised by how easily the women accepted her presence, including her in their conversations without probing questions about her past. By midday, the sun was high and hot. The men took a break for the substantial meal the women had prepared. Harriet was serving pie when Fletcher approached her, hat in hand, his shirt damp with sweat and his face flushed from exertion. "Hope you're enjoying yourself," he said, accepting a slice of apple pie from her. "I am. Your home is beautiful," pride shone in his eyes. "Been a lot of work, but worth every blister and backache." As they talked, Harriet noticed a slender blonde woman watching them from nearby. The woman approached, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Fletcher Tanner, you promised to introduce me to your new friend," she said, her voice honey-sweet. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Of course. Miss Sarah Miller, this is Miss Harriet Grayson. Harriet, Sarah teaches at our little schoolhouse in town." "How lovely to meet you, Miss Grayson," Sarah said, extending a gloved hand. "We don't get many new faces in Redemption Creek." "It's nice to meet you as well," Harriet replied, noting the territorial way Sarah positioned herself slightly closer to Fletcher. "Miss Grayson works at Mrs. Johnson's boarding house," Fletcher explained. "Best biscuits this side of the Mississippi, according to Mrs. Johnson." Sarah's smile tightened. "How charming. And where were you before Redemption Creek, Miss Grayson? Do you have family nearby?" Harriet tensed at the direct question. No family. I came from back east. All alone. How brave of you." Sarah's tone suggested recklessness rather than courage. Fletcher frowned slightly. "Harriet has made quite an impression on our little community in a short time. Mrs. Johnson says she's never had such help." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the barn drew everyone's attention. A horse had gotten loose and was galloping through the yard, sending people scattering. Without hesitation, Fletcher handed his plate to Sarah and took off running. Harriet watched in amazement as he intercepted the panicked animal, speaking softly and reaching for its trailing reins. The horse reared once, but Fletcher stood his ground, and gradually the animal calmed enough for him to take hold. "He's good with troubled creatures, Mrs. Johnson said, suddenly beside Harriet. "Always has been." The older woman gave Harriet a knowing look that made her blush. "I'm not troubled," Harriet protested weakly. "Honey, we've all got troubles. Some are just fresher than others." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. As the day cooled toward evening, the hay cutting was completed, and a sense of celebration filled the air. Someone brought out a fiddle, and impromptu dancing began in the cleared area near the house. Harriet was helping clean up when Fletcher found her again. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. She hesitated, looking around at the gathering. "I don't think that would be wise." "One dance, Harriet, to thank you for your help today." The music was lively, and several couples were already spinning around the makeshift dance floor. Against her better judgment, Harriet nodded. Fletcher's hand was warm and calloused as it closed gently around hers. His other hand rested lightly at her waist as he guided her into the dance. It had been so long since Harriet had been touched with such care that she felt almost dizzy from it. "You're good at this," Fletcher said as they moved in time to the music. "My father taught me when I was young," she admitted, "before he died." "You were close to him," Harriet nodded, surprising herself with her willingness to share. "He was a bookkeeper. Always had ink-stained fingers and smelled like paper and tobacco. He used to say dancing was mathematics in motion." Fletcher smiled. "Smart man. My pa couldn't dance to save his life, had 2 left feet and the rhythm of a startled rabbit, according to my mother." Harriet found herself laughing, and the sound surprised her. It had been so long since genuine mirth had bubbled from her lips. As they danced, she became aware of eyes watching them. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the gathering, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Several other townspeople were glancing their way as well, some with curious expressions, others with disapproval. The music ended, and Harriet stepped back quickly. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Tanner. I should help Mrs. Johnson prepare to leave." Fletcher looked like he wanted to say more, but he nodded. "Of course." As Harriet turned to go, Sarah intercepted her, a glass of lemonade in hand. "Miss Grayson, before you rush off, I wanted a moment." Harriet steeled herself. "Yes, Miss Miller." Sarah's voice was low, meant only for Harriet's ears. "Fletcher Tanner is one of the most eligible men in this county. He deserves a wife of good standing and reputation." Harriet felt her chest tighten. "I'm sure he does. I've known him for 5 years. We have an understanding." "Then you have nothing to worry about for me," Harriet replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Now if you'll excuse me." As she walked away, Sarah called after her, "People talk, Miss Grayson, and they're already talking about you." The ride back to town was quiet. Mrs. Johnson seemed to sense Harriet's troubled thoughts and didn't press her for conversation. Only when they were unloading the wagon at the boarding house did the older woman speak her mind. "Sarah Miller has been setting her cap for Fletcher Tanner since she arrived in town. But I've never seen him look at her the way he looks at you." Harriet shook her head. "It doesn't matter. She's right about one thing: he deserves someone with a spotless reputation." Mrs. Johnson snorted. "Spotless reputations are for people who have never lived, girl. We've all got spots if you look close enough." The following week, a package arrived for Harriet at the boarding house. Inside was a beautiful blue hair ribbon with a note that read simply, "Saw this and thought it would match your eyes. FT." Harriet ran her fingers over the silky ribbon, torn between pleasure and panic. That evening, she waited until most of the boarders had retired before approaching Mrs. Johnson in the kitchen. "Mrs. Johnson, may I speak with you about something personal?" The widow looked up from her mending. "Of course, dear. Come sit." Harriet twisted her hands in her lap. If someone had made a terrible mistake in their past, is it possible to ever truly start over? Mrs. Johnson set her sewing aside. "That depends on the mistake, I suppose, and whether you've learned from it." "What if it wasn't exactly a mistake? What if it was more? A bad situation that led to bad choices?" Understanding dawned in Mrs. Johnson's eyes. "Harriet, are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you are, there are people here who would help you." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes. "I was married," she whispered. "Back east. His name was Marcus Grayson." Mrs. Johnson reached for Harriet's hand. As far as I know, he's still alive, but I ran away from him." The words tumbled out now, unstoppable. "He was cruel, violent, the last time I was with child. He was drunk, angry about something trivial. The beating was so bad I lost the baby. When he passed out, I took what money I could find and fled." Mrs. Johnson's face was grave. "Oh, child. I'm still legally his wife, but I'd rather die than go back to him." Harriet wiped at her tears. "Now you understand why I can't, why Fletcher Tanner." "I understand why you've been keeping to yourself," Mrs. Johnson said gently, "but Fletcher isn't the kind of man to judge someone for surviving hardship." "It's not just that," Harriet said. "What if Marcus comes looking for me? He'd have every legal right to reclaim me as his wife. Anyone associated with me would be in danger." "Do you think he's searching for you?" Harriet shook her head slowly. "I don't know. He always controlled all our money, so I took what I could, about $200. Enough that he might come looking just for that." She shuddered. "Or to punish me for leaving." Mrs. Johnson squeezed her hand. "Well, you're not alone anymore, and this town protects its own." The next day, Fletcher appeared at the boarding house just as Harriet was sweeping the front porch. The sight of him made her heart race, both with pleasure and anxiety. "Afternoon, Harriet. Thought I might convince you to take a walk with me." She glanced around nervously. "I have chores to finish." "I already asked Mrs. Johnson if she could spare you for an hour. She seemed mighty agreeable." Harriet hesitated, then set her broom aside. "Just a short walk." They strolled toward the creek that ran along the edge of town. The spring day was warm, and wildflowers dotted the banks of the water. Fletcher maintained a respectful distance between them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I wanted to thank you again for helping at the hay cutting," he said. "Many hands made light work." "It was an enjoyable day," she admitted. "Your ranch is impressive. Been working on it for 10 years now. Started with just 50 acres and a dilapidated cabin. Added land when I could afford it." "You must be very proud." Fletcher nodded, then added quietly, "Though a big house feels empty sometimes with no one to share it." Harriet's throat tightened. Fletcher, I know you've been avoiding me, he interrupted gently, and I respect your privacy, but I'd like to understand why. She stopped walking, staring out at the flowing water. It's complicated. Most important things are, Harriet took a deep breath. I'm not free to consider the kind of attention you've been showing me. Fletcher's expression remained patient. Are you already spoken for? Is there someone back east? Yes, she whispered. A husband. She watched his face carefully, saw the brief flash of disappointment before his features smoothed into careful neutrality. I see, he said quietly. Is he joining you here? No, Harriet said firmly. I left him. But the law doesn't recognize that. In the eyes of God and country, I'm still Marcus Grayson's wife. Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Did he hurt you? The direct question caught her off guard. She looked away, unable to speak the affirmation, but her silence was answer enough. Fletcher's voice was tight with controlled anger. No man has the right to harm his wife, legal or not. The law disagrees, Harriet said bitterly. A husband's authority over his wife is absolute. The law isn't always right. Fletcher stepped closer, though he still didn't touch her. Harriet, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his. I would never ask you to do anything that compromised your principles or put you in danger, but I hope we can at least be friends. The simple offer of friendship with no demands or expectations broke something inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Why would you want to be friends with someone like me? Fletcher's expression softened. Because you're brave and kind and stronger than you know. He reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, offering it to her. And because I enjoy your company more than just about anyone else's in this town. Harriet took the handkerchief, wiping at her tears. Even Sarah Miller's, she asked, attempting a weak joke. Fletcher's smile was rueful. Especially Sarah Miller's. Though don't tell her I said so, she's on the committee that approves my church donations. That startled a laugh from Harriet. You're a good man, Fletcher Tanner. I try to be, he said simply. Now, shall we continue our walk as friends? The next few weeks brought a gradual shift in Harriet's life in Redemption Creek. Her friendship with Fletcher grew, carefully maintained within the bounds of propriety. They often walked together on Sunday afternoons after church, sometimes accompanied by Mrs. Johnson. Occasionally, Fletcher would invite Harriet and the widow to Sunday dinner at his ranch, where his housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera, served meals that rivaled any fine restaurant back east. As spring warmed into summer, Harriet found herself smiling more, sleeping better, and feeling less like a fugitive. The townspeople, following Fletcher's lead, began to accept her presence. She was invited to join the ladies' quilting circle and even helped organize a box social to raise money for a new church bell. Only Sarah Miller and a few of her closest friends maintained a cool distance, their disapproval evident in sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped when Harriet approached. One hot July afternoon, Harriet was returning from delivering a basket of Mrs. Johnson's preserves to the church pastor's wife when she noticed a stranger in town. He stood outside the sheriff's office, speaking with Sheriff Dawson. Something about the man's posture, the way he held himself with arrogant confidence, sent a chill through her despite the summer heat. Harriet ducked quickly into the alley between the general store and the barber shop, her heart pounding. Though she couldn't see the stranger's face clearly from this distance, something about him was hauntingly familiar. She waited until the man and the sheriff disappeared into the jailhouse, before hurrying back to the boarding house by a circuitous route. Once safely inside, she rushed to her room and pulled out the small valise she kept packed under her bed, a habit from her days of running that she'd never abandoned. There was a soft knock at her door. "Harriet, are you all right?" Mrs. Johnson's concerned voice came through the wood. Harriet opened the door, her face pale. "There's a stranger in town," she whispered. "Talking to the sheriff, I'm afraid it might be someone looking for me." Mrs. Johnson frowned. "Did you get a good look at him?" "No, but something about him." She shuddered. "I can't take the chance." "Now don't go jumping to conclusions," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "This is a growing town. We get strangers passing through all the time. But what if it's him, or someone he sent? Then we'll deal with it." Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. "You're not alone anymore, remember." Harriet tried to calm her racing thoughts. "You're right, I'm being foolish." "Not foolish, cautious. There's a difference." The older woman eyed the half-packed valise. "But maybe wait before you start packing your things. Let me send word to Fletcher. He'll know what's happening in town." 2 hours later, Fletcher arrived at the boarding house. Harriet met him in the small parlor, Mrs. Johnson discreetly leaving them alone while remaining within earshot in the adjoining dining room. "Mrs. Johnson said you were worried about a stranger in town," Fletcher said without preamble. Harriet nodded. "I saw him talking to Sheriff Dawson. Something about him frightened me. Tall fellow, dark hair, fancy Eastern clothes," her breath caught. "Yes, who is he?" "Name's Edward Prescott, according to the sheriff. Says he's looking for his sister-in-law who ran off from Philadelphia some months back. Apparently, she took money that didn't belong to her." Harriet sank onto the settee, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Edward Prescott is Marcus's business partner. They're close as brothers." Her voice shook. "He's found me." Fletcher sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Harriet, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "I won't let anyone take you anywhere against your will," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you understand me?" "You don't understand. The law is on their side. I did take money, it was the only way I could escape, and I'm still legally his wife." "I understand perfectly well," Fletcher replied. "I also understand that a man who beats his wife forfeits any right to her loyalty or obedience, legal papers be damned." The vehemence in his tone surprised her. "What can we do? If I run, he'll just follow." Fletcher considered for a moment. "First, we need to know exactly what this Prescott fellow is telling people. Right now, he's asking general questions describing a woman who matches you but not using your name. Says she might be using her maiden name or some other alias." "He doesn't know I kept the Grayson name," Harriet murmured. "I thought it would be safer, less suspicious than a single woman traveling alone." "Smart thinking," Fletcher nodded. "For now, you should stay here, out of sight as much as possible. I'll speak with Sheriff Dawson, feel out what he knows." "The sheriff is a good man," Mrs. Johnson interjected from the doorway, abandoning any pretense of not listening. "But he's bound by the law." Fletcher's jaw set in a hard line. Sometimes the law needs a little help finding justice. Over the next 2 days, Harriet remained at the boarding house, venturing out only to help Mrs. Johnson with essential chores. Fletcher kept them informed of Prescott's movements. The man had taken a room at the hotel and spent his days showing Harriet's description to townspeople and asking questions. On the 3rd day, disaster struck. Harriet was in the kitchen garden, gathering vegetables for the evening meal, when she heard a voice that made her blood freeze. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand you run the finest boarding house in Redemption Creek." Harriet crouched lower behind the tall bean poles, peering through the greenery to see Edward Prescott standing on the back porch, speaking with Mrs. Johnson. "That's kind of you to say, Mr. Prescott." "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Johnson's voice betrayed nothing of her knowledge about the man. "I'm looking for information about a young woman who might have passed through here some months back. My brother's wife, unfortunately, has had some episodes of mental instability. She ran away during one such episode, taking a substantial sum of money. The family is terribly worried about her welfare." "How distressing," Mrs. Johnson replied. "What does this young woman look like?" As Prescott described her right down to the small birthmark on her left wrist, Harriet felt sick with fear. There was no mistake. They were hunting her specifically. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," Mrs. Johnson said. "Most of my boarders are men working on the railroad extension. I only have 2 female boarders, currently the school teacher, Miss Miller, and my assistant, Miss Grayson. Neither matches your description, I'm afraid." Harriet's heart nearly stopped at hearing her name mentioned so casually. "Grayson, you say?" Prescott's voice sharpened with interest. "Might I speak with this Miss Grayson?" "She's not here at present," Mrs. Johnson replied smoothly. "Running errands in town. But as I said, she doesn't match your description. Miss Grayson is quite tall with dark hair. Your sister-in-law sounds rather petite and fair." The deliberate misdirection was clever, but Harriet wasn't sure Prescott would believe it. "Even so, I'd like to speak with everyone in town," Prescott insisted. "When do you expect Miss Grayson to return?" "Hard to say. She's a busy woman. But if I see her, I'll certainly mention you're looking to speak with her." After Prescott left, Mrs. Johnson came immediately to the garden. He's gone, but I don't think he's fooled. We need to get you out of here, and quickly. Within the hour, Fletcher arrived with a wagon. Mrs. Johnson sent word, he explained. I think you should come to the ranch for a while. It's easier to see strangers coming from a distance out there. Harriet hesitated. Won't that seem suspicious, me suddenly going to stay at your ranch? Not if you're keeping Mrs. Rivera company while I'm away on business, Fletcher replied. I've let it be known I'm heading to Denver tomorrow to arrange a cattle sale. But you're not really going. I'll ride out openly, then circle back after dark. No one will know I'm still at the ranch except Mrs. Rivera and my foreman, Gil. Both would die before betraying a confidence. The plan was risky, but Harriet could see no alternative. That evening, she slipped out the back of the boarding house and into Fletcher's waiting wagon, covered by a tarp until they were safely out of town. The ranch house was warm and welcoming, with Mrs. Rivera fussing over Harriet like a mother hen. The elderly housekeeper showed her to a comfortable guest room on the second floor, with windows overlooking the creek and distant mountains. Mr. Fletcher says you stay as long as needed, Mrs. Rivera said in her accented English. No one bother you here. True to his word, Fletcher departed visibly the next morning, riding his distinctive black stallion toward Denver. What the townspeople couldn't see was Gil Roberts following at a distance with a second horse for Fletcher's return journey. 3 days passed in relative peace. Harriet helped Mrs. Rivera with household chores and found comfort in the rhythms of ranch life. Each night, Fletcher returned secretly after dark, updating her on the situation in town. Prescott's getting frustrated, he reported on the third night as they sat in the kitchen, Mrs. Rivera discreetly busy in the pantry. He's been showing your picture around a small photograph he claims your husband gave him. Harriet twisted her hands in her lap. Has anyone recognized me? Not yet. But Sarah Miller is asking questions about why you suddenly left town. She seems mighty interested in your whereabouts. She doesn't like me, Harriet said simply. She sees me as competition, though I've never done anything to encourage that idea. Fletcher's expression was unreadable. Sarah makes assumptions. On the fourth day, disaster struck. Harriet was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard approaching horses. Thinking it might be ranch hands returning from the range, she paid little attention until Mrs. Rivera hurried from the house. Riders coming, not our men. The housekeeper pulled Harriet toward the house. Quick, upstairs. Harriet ran to her room and peered cautiously from behind the curtain. Her heart sank as she recognized Edward Prescott riding beside Sheriff Dawson. Behind them came 2 more men she didn't recognize, and Sarah Miller in a small buggy. They found me, she whispered, backing away from the window. Her mind raced. There was nowhere to run. The ranch was isolated, miles from any neighbor who might help. Fletcher wouldn't return until after dark. By then, it might be too late. She could hear voices below as Mrs. Rivera met the visitors at the door. The housekeeper would stall as long as possible, but eventually they would search the house. Harriet looked frantically around the room, seeking any possible escape. The window. It overlooked a section of sloped roof above the kitchen. If she could climb out and make her way to the edge, she might be able to drop to the ground on the far side of the house, away from the visitor's sight. From there, she could run to the creek and follow it downstream, using the trees and brush for cover. Harriet had just eased the window open when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Abandoning caution, she climbed quickly onto the sill, her skirts hampering her movement as she maneuvered onto the roof. The wooden shingles were hot from the afternoon sun, and she had to move carefully to avoid slipping. She had nearly reached the edge when she heard a shout. Looking back, she saw Edward Prescott leaning out the window she'd just escaped through. There she is, on the roof. Heart pounding, Harriet abandoned caution and scrambled toward the edge. The ground was further down than she'd estimated, at least 12 feet, but she had no choice. She lowered herself as far as she could, hanging by her hands from the roof's edge, then let go. The landing sent pain shooting through her ankles and knees, but she forced herself upright and ran toward the creek. Behind her, she could hear men shouting and the sound of pursuit. Harriet reached the creek and splashed into the water, following it downstream as she'd planned. The cool water soaked her skirts, making them heavy and difficult to manage, but also erasing any tracks she might leave on the soft bank. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile when she heard a horse splashing through the water behind her. Glancing back, she saw Sheriff Dawson gaining rapidly. With no chance of outrunning a mounted man, Harriet made a desperate decision. She threw herself into deeper water and began swimming across the creek toward a dense thicket on the far side. The current was stronger than she'd anticipated, pulling her downstream as she fought to cross. Her sodden clothes dragged at her like anchors. She was nearly to the far bank when her foot caught on something underwater, a root or submerged branch, and pain lanced through her ankle as she was pulled under. Panic seized her as water closed over her head. She thrashed desperately, breaking the surface with a gasp only to be dragged under again by her heavy skirts. In that moment, Harriet was certain she would drown, then strong arms were around her, pulling her upward. She broke the surface again, coughing and sputtering, to find Fletcher beside her in the water. His hat was gone, his clothes as soaked as hers, but his grip was firm as he guided her toward the bank. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you stand?" Harriet tried to put weight on her injured ankle and cried out in pain. Without hesitation, Fletcher lifted her in his arms and carried her the remaining few steps to shore, setting her gently on the grassy bank. By now, Sheriff Dawson had ridden his horse across the creek at a shallower point and was approaching them. Edward Prescott and one of the other men had followed on foot and were crossing as well. "Fletcher, what the hell are you doing here?" Sheriff Dawson demanded. "Thought you were in Denver." Fletcher stood, positioning himself between Harriet and the approaching men. "Changed my plans, John. Good thing I did." Prescott splashed out of the creek, his fine eastern clothes ruined by the water. "That's her," he said triumphantly, pointing at Harriet. "That's Harriet Grayson, my brother's wife," the sheriff dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Grayson, this man claims you're married to his brother and that you stole a significant amount of money before running away. Is that true?" Before Harriet could answer, Fletcher spoke. "She left an abusive husband, John, took only what she needed to escape." "That's a lie," Prescott snapped. "Marcus Grayson is a respected businessman in Philadelphia. This woman has a history of mental instability and fabrication." "Is that so?" Fletcher's voice was dangerously quiet. "Then how do you explain the scars on her back? The ones left by her respected husband's belt?" Harriet stared at Fletcher in shock. She had never shown him her scars, never spoken of them to anyone. "Mrs. Johnson told me," he said softly, answering her unspoken question. "She saw them when she helped you bathe after you were ill this winter." Sheriff Dawson looked troubled. "Mr. Prescott, those are serious counter-allegations." "They're lies," Prescott insisted, "invented to gain sympathy. The fact remains that she is legally Marcus Grayson's wife, and she took his money. I have the authority to return her to Philadelphia." "Actually, you don't," Fletcher said calmly. "Not without a proper warrant, which I'm guessing you don't have. And even with one, you'd have to prove her identity beyond doubt." "I have a photograph, which shows some resemblance to Miss Grayson here, but is hardly definitive proof," Fletcher interrupted. "Especially for a woman you claim suffers from mental instability. Would such a person be capable of traveling across the country alone, of establishing herself respectably in a new community, of working diligently and honestly as Miss Grayson has done for months?" Harriet watched this exchange with growing hope. Fletcher was using legal arguments to create doubt that might give her precious time. Sarah Miller, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "She's been deceiving all of us," she said bitterly, "presenting herself as a respectable widow when she's actually a runaway wife." Fletcher turned to her with a hard expression. "Miss Miller, I understand you're disappointed that I haven't returned your affections, but involving yourself in this situation is beneath you." Sarah flushed scarlet. "I'm merely concerned with upholding proper moral standards in our community." "Then you should be the first to condemn a man who beats his wife so severely she loses their child," Fletcher replied, his voice cutting. A shocked silence fell over the group. Even Prescott seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Sheriff Dawson removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "This is getting complicated, and I don't rightly know where the law stands on such matters." Mr. Prescott, I can't just hand this woman over to you based on a photograph and your word. We'll need to sort this out properly. I demand you arrest her for theft at minimum, Prescott insisted. Without proof of the amount stolen or evidence it was even theft, that's not how things work out here. The sheriff replaced his hat. Miss Grayson needs medical attention for that ankle. I suggest we all return to town and consult the circuit judge when he arrives next week. A week. Prescott was outraged. My brother is expecting. Your brother will have to wait, Fletcher interrupted firmly. Unless you'd prefer I send a telegraph to the Philadelphia authorities asking about certain business practices I've heard Marcus Grayson engages in. I understand the banking commission has been investigating some questionable investments. Harriet looked at Fletcher in surprise. This was news to her, though she'd always suspected Marcus's business dealings weren't entirely above board. Prescott's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Tanner. Marcus Grayson isn't a man you want as an enemy. Neither am I, Fletcher replied evenly. The standoff might have continued, but Harriet's injured ankle chose that moment to give a particularly painful throb, causing her to gasp. Fletcher was immediately at her side. This discussion is over for now, he said firmly. Miss Grayson needs a doctor. To Harriet's surprise, Sheriff Dawson nodded in agreement. Fletcher's right. Mr. Prescott, you're welcome to present your case to Judge Wilson when he arrives. Until then, I see no grounds for arrest or forced removal. Prescott looked like he wanted to argue further but seemed to recognize he was outnumbered. This isn't over, he warned, then turned and stalked back toward the ranch house, the second man following him. Sarah Miller gave Fletcher a look of profound disappointment before turning to follow as well. Only the sheriff remained, looking uncomfortable. Fletcher, you're walking a fine line here, he said quietly. If she is legally married, she's also legally entitled to protection from harm, Fletcher interrupted. I'm providing that protection, John, nothing more, the sheriff sighed. Get her to Doc Weber. I'll try to keep Prescott calm until the judge arrives. He mounted his horse and rode after the others, leaving Fletcher and Harriet alone by the creek. Once they were alone, Fletcher gently examined Harriet's ankle. Can you move it at all? She winced as she tried. A little. I don't think it's broken, just badly twisted. Even so, we need to get you to town. Doc Weber should look at it. He frowned, considering their options. I sent Gil with the wagon to deliver supplies to the line camp. He won't be back until tomorrow. We can't go back to the ranch house, Harriet said anxiously. Prescott is there. No, but there's a line shack about 2 miles downstream. We can shelter there tonight and I'll ride for the doctor in the morning. He looked at her wet clothing. Can you hold on a little longer in those wet things? I have some spare clothes at the shack, but it's a fair walk. I'll manage, Harriet said, though she was already shivering despite the summer warmth. Fletcher removed his sodden vest and rolled up his sleeves. I'm going to have to carry you. That ankle won't take your weight. Before she could protest, he scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. Harriet instinctively put her arms around his neck to steady herself, suddenly very aware of his strength and the closeness of his face to hers. I'm sorry for putting you in this position, she said quietly as he began walking along the creek bank. You shouldn't have to fight my battles. Fletcher's expression was determined. Your battles became mine the moment Prescott threatened you, and for the record, I'm not sorry at all. They traveled in silence for some time, the only sounds the rushing creek and distant birds. Despite the discomfort of her wet clothes and throbbing ankle, Harriet felt strangely safe in Fletcher's arms. How did you know to come back early? She asked eventually. You weren't due until after dark. Gil met me on the trail with news that Sarah Miller had been asking questions about your whereabouts. I had a bad feeling. His arms tightened slightly around her. I should never have left you alone. You couldn't have known Prescott would find me so quickly. Sarah must have told him. She saw us together enough times to be suspicious when you suddenly disappeared the same time I supposedly left for Denver, Harriet sighed. She really doesn't like me. She doesn't like anyone she perceives as a threat to her plans, Fletcher corrected. And she's had plans for me for years, despite my lack of encouragement. They rounded a bend in the creek, and a small log cabin came into view. It was a simple structure with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Fletcher carried her to the door and somehow managed to open it without putting her down. Inside was a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot against one wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and some shelves holding basic supplies. It was clean and dry if sparse. Fletcher set Harriet gently on the cot. "Wait here. I need to gather some firewood." While he was outside, Harriet took stock of her situation. Her ankle was swelling badly, and her wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin. She tried not to think about Prescott and what might happen when the circuit judge arrived. Would he force her to return to Marcus? The thought made her physically ill. Fletcher returned with an armload of wood and quickly built a fire in the fireplace. The small cabin soon filled with welcome warmth. "There's a trunk with some spare clothes in the corner," he said, pointing. "Nothing fancy, just some work shirts and trousers, but they're dry. I'll wait outside while you change." Harriet flushed at the impropriety of wearing a man's clothes, but practicality won out over propriety. "Thank you." When Fletcher stepped outside, she struggled out of her wet dress and petticoats. Her corset was a sodden, uncomfortable mess, and she abandoned it as well, leaving only her chemise. From the trunk, she selected the smallest shirt she could find, still enormous on her frame, and a pair of trousers she had to roll up several times at the ankles. She used a piece of rope as a belt to keep the trousers from falling down entirely. "I'm decent," she called when she was finished. Fletcher returned, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in his clothes before he quickly schooled his expression. "Better, much," she admitted, "though I must look a fright. You look." He seemed to search for an appropriate word, alive. "After seeing you go under in that creek, that's all that matters to me." He hung her wet clothes near the fire to dry, then set about preparing a simple meal from the shack's supplies: beans, jerky, and coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, the events of the day catching up with them both. After they'd eaten, Fletcher carefully examined her ankle again. "It's badly swollen, but the skin isn't broken. I'll ride for Doc Weber at first light." "And then what?" Harriet asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her. "Even if the judge doesn't force me to go back immediately, Edward won't give up, and eventually Marcus will come himself." Fletcher sat beside her on the cot. "We'll face that when it comes. For now, you're safe." "For now," she repeated softly, "but for how long?" "Even if I run again, they'll keep searching. Marcus doesn't forgive what he sees as betrayal." "Harriet." Fletcher took her hand gently in his. "I meant what I said to Prescott. I won't let anyone take you back to a man who hurt you." She looked at their joined hands. "Why are you doing all this?" "Risking so much for me." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Because from the moment I met you, something inside me recognized something inside you, like we were meant to find each other." Harriet's breath caught. "Fletcher, let me finish. I know you're married in the eyes of the law. I know there are obstacles that seem insurmountable. But I also know that what your husband did to you was wrong, and no law or custom can make it right." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes. "No one will want me after this. Even if I somehow escape Marcus legally, I'll always be damaged goods or runaway wife with a scandalous past." Fletcher's hand tightened around hers. "Then I guess I'm no one," he said softly. "Because I want you, Harriet Grayson. I want you safe. I want you happy. I want you by my side if you'll have me." The simple declaration broke the last of Harriet's resistance. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as years of pain and loneliness gave way to a fragile, newborn hope. "But how?" she whispered. "How can this possibly work?" "One step at a time," Fletcher answered, gently wiping away her tears. "First, we get through this immediate threat, then we find a way for you to be legally free. Divorce is nearly impossible, especially for a woman. And even if I could obtain one, the scandal would follow us forever." "I don't care about scandal, and there might be other options. Marcus Grayson sounds like a man with enemies. If what I've heard about his business dealings is true, he might prefer to grant you a quiet divorce rather than face certain exposures." Harriet stared at him in wonder. "You've been investigating him," Fletcher nodded. "I have a friend in Denver who works for Pinkerton. He's been making discreet inquiries." Fresh tears threatened. "You did that for me, even before today." "I would do a great deal more for you, Harriet." His voice was husky with emotion. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first evening I walked you home." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Harriet felt as if her heart might burst with the conflicting emotions of joy and fear. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now." Fletcher released her hand and stood. "It's been a long day and you need rest. Take the cot, I'll sleep by the fire." But as he turned to go, Harriet caught his hand. "Fletcher." He looked back at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "I think," she began hesitantly, "I think I might be falling in love with you too, and that terrifies me more than anything Marcus could do to me." Fletcher knelt beside the cot so they were eye to eye. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because loving someone means being vulnerable, and the last time I was vulnerable with a man, he nearly destroyed me." "I am not Marcus Grayson," Fletcher said, his voice low and fierce. "I would cut off my right arm before I'd raise it against you." Harriet believed him. Despite everything her experience had taught her about men and marriage, she believed this man with a bone-deep certainty she couldn't explain. "I know," she whispered. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Fletcher leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, and over far too quickly. But it sealed something between them, a promise more binding than any legal document. "Now sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." The next morning, Fletcher rode for town at dawn while Harriet remained at the line shack. Her ankle was still too swollen for her to walk, and they agreed it was safer for her to stay hidden while Fletcher brought back Doc Weber and assessed the situation in town. Alone in the cabin, Harriet had time to reflect on everything that had happened and on the feelings she'd admitted to Fletcher. She'd spent so long running from her past, protecting herself from further harm, that opening her heart again seemed almost unimaginable. Yet somehow this quiet, steadfast rancher had slipped past her defenses. By mid-afternoon, she heard approaching horses. Peering anxiously through the window, she was relieved to see Fletcher riding alongside an older man she recognized as Doc Weber, with Mrs. Johnson following in a small wagon. "The cavalry has arrived," Fletcher announced as he helped her outside to the porch where Doc Weber could examine her ankle. The doctor was thorough but gentle, prodding the swollen joint and asking her to move it in various directions. "A bad sprain," he finally pronounced. "No breaks that I can detect. You'll need to stay off it for at least a week, preferably 2, and keep it elevated when possible." "What's happening in town?" Harriet asked as the doctor wrapped her ankle with a tight bandage. Mrs. Johnson snorted. "That Prescott fellow is making a nuisance of himself, talking to anyone who will listen about his poor, deranged sister-in-law." "Most folks aren't buying it," Fletcher added, leaning against the porch post. "They know you, Harriet. They've seen you work hard and live honestly these past months. It doesn't match the picture Prescott is painting. But the law is still the law," Doc Weber said soberly. "Sheriff Dawson is in a tight spot. He knows something's not right about Prescott's story, but legally, a husband does have rights over his wife." Harriet's heart sank. "So when the judge comes, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Fletcher said firmly. "For now, you need to rest and heal. Mrs. Johnson has brought some of your things, and she's agreed to stay with you here while I return to the ranch to deal with Prescott." "I can't ask both of you to hide out here with me," Harriet protested. "You didn't ask, dear. We offered." Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. "Besides, I could use a few days away from town myself. The gossip is exhausting." After Doc Weber departed with promises to check on her in a few days, Fletcher helped move Harriet's things into the cabin. Mrs. Johnson immediately set about making the small space more comfortable, hanging a blanket to create a private sleeping area for Harriet, and organizing the meager supplies with military efficiency. When it was time for Fletcher to leave, he took Harriet's hand and led her to a private spot just outside the cabin door. "I meant what I said last night," he told her, his voice low and intense. "All of it." Harriet squeezed his hand. "So did I." "But Fletcher, you have to be realistic about what you're facing. Even if by some miracle I could obtain a divorce, there would be scandal. Your standing in the community is not more important to me than you are," he interrupted. "Harriet, I spent 4 years fighting in a war where I saw men die for causes less worthy than protecting someone they love. If standing by you means facing a little gossip and disapproval, that's a battle I'm happy to fight." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his steady gaze. "I don't deserve you. You deserve far better," he corrected gently. "But I'm what you've got, so I guess you'll have to make do." That drew a small laugh from her, which had clearly been his intention. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "Try to rest that ankle." The next few days established a pattern. Fletcher would come in the morning, bringing supplies and news from town, then return to the ranch in the afternoon to maintain appearances and monitor Prescott's activities. Mrs. Johnson provided companionship and practical care, her matter-of-fact approach to the situation helping to keep Harriet's spirits from sinking too low. On the third day, Fletcher arrived with unexpected news. The circuit judge arrived early. He's hearing cases today at the town hall. Harriet felt her heart race with anxiety. Has Prescott spoken with him yet? Yes, first thing this morning. Fletcher's expression was grim. He's presenting a compelling case, medical documents suggesting your mental instability, testimony from concerned friends back in Philadelphia, even a letter supposedly from a doctor who treated you. All lies, Harriet said bitterly. Marcus has physicians in his pocket. He could get them to write anything. Judge Wilson is no fool. He's been riding circuit in this territory for 15 years and can smell a manipulated story, but he's also bound by the law. Mrs. Johnson, who had been quietly preparing lunch, joined the conversation. So what happens now? The judge wants to hear Harriet's side. He's issued a summons for her to appear tomorrow morning. Harriet paled. If I go into town, Prescott might try to take me by force. Not with me and half the ranch hands accompanying you, Fletcher assured her. Besides, the judge was explicit that you're to be given fair hearing before any action is taken. That night, after Mrs. Johnson had retired to her makeshift bed by the fireplace, Harriet sat on the porch steps, staring at the stars and wondering what the next day would bring. Fletcher, who had decided to stay the night rather than risk leaving the women alone, joined her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. She shook her head. "Too many thoughts." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the creek and distant coyotes the only interruption. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Harriet asked finally. "If you'd met a woman without my complications, someone like Sarah Miller," Fletcher chuckled softly. "Sarah Miller has never been my idea of a suitable wife, regardless of what she or the town gossips might think. But surely you've thought about marriage, a family." "Of course I have." He looked up at the star-filled sky. "When I came back from the war, I was broken in many ways. Seen too much death, done things I'm not proud of, took years before I could imagine sharing my life with someone else." Harriet listened, realizing how little she knew about his past despite the deep connection they'd forged. "My brother died at Gettysburg," Fletcher continued quietly. "He was 19, had his whole life ahead of him. I was with him at the end, held him while he bled out from a Confederate Minié ball." "I'm so sorry," Harriet whispered, reaching for his hand. "After that, I couldn't see the point of any of it, the fighting, the dying, the hate. I finished my enlistment because I'd given my word, but when it was over, I headed west and never looked back." He squeezed her hand gently. "For a long time, I thought I'd live alone, build my ranch, work the land, find whatever peace I could in solitude. What changed?" Fletcher turned to look at her, his expression soft in the moonlight. "You did. You made me want more than just existence. You made me want a life again." Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "And look what that's gotten you, hiding in a lined shack, facing legal troubles, risking your reputation." "Worth it," he said simply. "Every bit." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Fletcher had brought a dress from Harriet's room at the boarding house, a simple blue calico that was her best, and she changed carefully, mindful of her still tender ankle. Mrs. Johnson helped her arrange her hair and even produced a small pot of cream to soothe the windburn on Harriet's cheeks. "There," the widow said, stepping back to assess her work. "You look like the respectable, sane woman you are." Fletcher had brought his wagon, making it easier for Harriet to travel with her injured ankle. As promised, 4 of his ranch hands rode with them as escort, their presence a clear message that Harriet was under Fletcher's protection. As they approached town, Harriet's anxiety grew. What if the judge ordered her immediate return to Marcus? What if Prescott had marshaled enough legal authority to force compliance? What if— "Stop worrying," Fletcher said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Remember, you're not alone anymore." The town hall was crowded when they arrived. It seemed most of Redemption Creek had turned out to witness the unusual proceedings. Sheriff Dawson met them at the door, his expression professionally neutral. "Judge is ready," he said simply, leading them inside. The room fell silent as Harriet entered, leaning on Fletcher's arm due to her ankle. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to search for Prescott in the crowd, though she could feel his presence like a cold draft. Judge Wilson was a silver-haired man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He nodded as Harriet was helped to a chair facing his makeshift bench. "Mrs. Grayson, or do you prefer Miss?" he began without preamble. "Miss, Your Honor," Harriet replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Very well, Miss Grayson. I've heard considerable testimony regarding your situation from Mr. Edward Prescott, representing his brother, Marcus Grayson. He alleges you are legally married to Mr. Grayson, that you absconded with a significant sum of money, and that your actions were influenced by a history of mental instability. How do you respond to these allegations?" Harriet took a deep breath. "I am legally married to Marcus Grayson, Your Honor. That much is true. The rest is false." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Please elaborate," the judge instructed. "I left my husband because he was violent. His abuse escalated over our 5 years of marriage until I feared for my life. The night I fled, he had beaten me so severely that I lost our unborn child." Her voice wavered but did not break. "I took approximately $200 from the household account's money that was rightfully mine, as I had brought it to the marriage as a small inheritance from my parents." "These are serious counter-allegations," Judge Wilson said gravely. "Do you have any evidence to support your claims of abuse?" Fletcher stood. "Your Honor, if I may," the judge nodded. "Doc Weber examined Miss Grayson yesterday. He can testify to the presence of scars consistent with repeated physical abuse." Doc Weber rose from his seat in the crowd. "That's correct, Your Honor. Miss Grayson bears multiple scars on her back and shoulders that could only have come from deliberate injury, likely from a belt or similar implement." Edward Prescott jumped to his feet. "This is outrageous. My brother is a respected businessman. This woman has clearly manipulated these people with her tales of woe." "Sit down, Mr. Prescott," the judge ordered sharply. "You've had your say." Turning back to Harriet, his expression softened slightly. "Miss Grayson, while I am deeply troubled by your account, I must remind you that under current law, a husband has considerable authority over his wife. Even allegations of abuse do not necessarily provide legal grounds for a wife to abandon her marriage." Harriet's heart sank. "However," the judge continued, "neither am I inclined to force a woman to return to a situation where she may be in danger, regardless of legal technicalities." Hope flickered in Harriet's chest. "My ruling is as follows. Miss Grayson will not be compelled to return to Philadelphia with Mr. Prescott at this time. However, I am issuing a formal notice to Marcus Grayson that his wife has been located and that legal proceedings regarding their marital status should be pursued through proper channels." Edward Prescott was on his feet again. "This is unacceptable. I was promised custody. You were promised a fair hearing. Nothing more," Judge Wilson interrupted coldly. "If your brother wishes to pursue this matter, he may file for divorce on grounds of abandonment or petition for a legal separation. But I will not order a woman forcibly return to a husband she clearly fears, especially given the physical evidence supporting her claims of abuse." The relief that washed over Harriet was so intense that she nearly fainted. Fletcher's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "Thank you, Your Honor," she managed. The judge wasn't finished. "Miss Grayson, while you are free to remain in Redemption Creek for now, you should be aware that your legal status remains complicated. Until your marriage is properly dissolved, you are still legally Mrs. Marcus Grayson. I strongly advise you to seek legal counsel regarding a formal separation or divorce." "I understand, Your Honor. Very well, this hearing is concluded." The judge banged his gavel once, then fixed Edward Prescott with a stern look. "Mr. Prescott, you are free to return to Philadelphia and inform your brother of my ruling. Should he wish to pursue further legal action, he may do so through the courts. But any attempt to remove Miss Grayson from this jurisdiction by force will be met with the full penalties of the law." "Is that clear?" Prescott's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "Perfectly clear, Your Honor." As the crowd began to disperse, Fletcher helped Harriet to her feet. "Let's get you back to the boarding house." Edward Prescott intercepted them at the door, his voice low with menace. "This isn't over. Marcus will not accept this ruling." Fletcher's expression hardened. "I think you should leave now, Prescott, while you still can." "Is that a threat, Tanner? A suggestion? This town protects its own." As if to emphasize his point, several men from the crowd moved to stand behind Fletcher, including Sheriff Dawson. Prescott looked from face to face, then stepped back. "You haven't heard the last of this. None of you have." With that, he stormed out of the town hall. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Harriet returned to the boarding house, where Mrs. Johnson and the other boarders welcomed her with warmth and support. Word of her testimony at the hearing had spread, and to her surprise, most of the town seemed firmly on her side. Even Sarah Miller maintained a chastened distance, her earlier antagonism dampened by the revelations about Harriet's past. Edward Prescott departed on the eastbound stage the day after the hearing, but his threats lingered in Harriet's mind. She knew Marcus well enough to be certain he wouldn't accept the judge's ruling without a fight. Fletcher visited every day, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, once a kitten from a litter born in his barn. As Harriet's ankle healed, they resumed their Sunday afternoon walks, now openly acknowledged as courting by the townspeople. 2 weeks after the hearing, Fletcher appeared at the boarding house with a serious expression. "I've had a telegram from my friend at Pinkerton," he said when they were seated in the parlor, Mrs. Johnson discreetly present as chaperone. "He's uncovered some interesting information about Marcus Grayson." Harriet's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "What kind of information?" "It seems your former husband has been involved in some questionable investment schemes. Several wealthy clients have lost significant sums, and there are whispers of fraud. Nothing has been proven yet, but the banking commission is investigating." "That doesn't surprise me," Harriet said quietly. Marcus was always obsessed with appearances, with being seen as more successful than he actually was. Fletcher leaned forward, his expression intent. "This could be leverage, Harriet. A man facing potential fraud charges can't afford additional scandal." "What are you suggesting?" "I've consulted a lawyer in Denver. He believes we could approach Marcus with an offer, a quiet divorce with no further claims on either side, in exchange for our silence about certain business matters." Harriet considered this. "You think he would agree?" "If the alternative is public exposure that could damage his business reputation. Yes, I think he might." Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in Harriet's heart. "And if he agrees, if I could be legally free," Fletcher reached for her hand, his expression softening. "Then I would very much like to ask you a certain question, Harriet Grayson, but I'll wait until you're truly free to answer it." 4 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, Harriet stood in Mrs. Johnson's parlor, smoothing the folds of her new blue dress. The divorce had been finalized with surprising speed once Marcus understood the alternatives. Fletcher's lawyer had handled everything, requiring Harriet to sign only a few papers without ever having to face her former husband again. Now, as she prepared for the small ceremony that would unite her life with Fletcher's, she could scarcely believe how much had changed in a year. From desperate fugitive to beloved bride, it seemed like someone else's story. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Johnson said, adjusting the simple veil on Harriet's head. "Fletcher won't know what hit him." Harriet smiled, fingering the locket around her neck, her parents' pictures still inside, but now joined by a small portrait of Fletcher. "I never thought I'd have this chance again. A real marriage based on love and respect. You deserve it, child." Mrs. Johnson blinked away tears. "Now, let's not keep that good man waiting any longer." The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held in the town's small church with most of Redemption Creek in attendance. Even Sarah Miller came, her initial resentment finally giving way to grudging acceptance. When Fletcher and Harriet exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. His voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her. Her response was equally firm, the shadows of her past finally receding in the light of this new beginning. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Collins declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Fletcher's kiss was gentle yet possessive, a promise of all the days to come. At the reception held at the ranch, the newly married couple moved from guest to guest, accepting congratulations and well wishes. When they finally had a moment alone on the porch, Fletcher pulled Harriet close. "Happy Mrs. Tanner?" he asked softly. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real. Believe it." He kissed her forehead. "This is just the beginning." As the celebration continued inside, they stood together watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose. The future stretched before them, a future they would build together, day by day, with love as its foundation. Harriet thought back to that moment by the creek when fear and despair had nearly overwhelmed her. "No one will want me after this," she had said. "Then I guess I'm no one," Fletcher had answered, but he wasn't no one, he was everything, and together they were home. 5 years later, Harriet sat on the front porch of the ranch house, watching her 3-year-old daughter chase butterflies in the yard while baby James napped in her arms. The ranch had prospered under Fletcher's careful management, expanding to include a thriving horse breeding operation that Harriet helped oversee. Fletcher emerged from the barn, dusty from a morning's work, but smiling when he caught sight of his family. Little Emmer ran to him with a squeal of delight, and he swung her up onto his shoulders with practiced ease. "Mama, Papa caught me," the child giggled as Fletcher carried her to the porch. "So I see," Harriet smiled. "And what has my wild butterfly been doing this morning?" "Helping Mrs. Rivera feed the chickens," Emma announced proudly, "and counting all the eggs. There were 12. "Such a good helper," Fletcher praised, setting her down gently. "Why don't you go see if Mrs. Rivera has any cookies ready? Tell her Papa says it's okay." As Emma skipped away, Fletcher sat beside Harriet, admiring their sleeping son. "He's growing so fast," he murmured, gently stroking the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "They both are," Harriet agreed, leaning against her husband's shoulder despite the dust. "Sometimes I look at them and can hardly breathe from the joy of it all." Fletcher pressed a kiss to her temple. "You've made this house a home, Harriet, made me a family again when I thought that chance was long gone." They sat together in contented silence, watching the afternoon sunlight play across the land that was their legacy to their children. Occasionally, the shadows of the past still visited Harriet in dreams, memories of fear and pain that might never completely fade, but they no longer had the power to define her. She was Harriet Tanner now, wife, mother, rancher. Loved, respected, free. And when doubts crept in, as they sometimes did, Fletcher was always there to remind her of that day by the creek, when a desperate woman believed she had nothing to offer and a steadfast man had proven her wrong. "No one will want me," she had said. "Then I guess I'm no one," he had answered. But he was someone, he was everything, and so now was she.